Good evening, everyone. My name is Zoe Sperling, Senior Director here at Hauser Wirth in London. On behalf of Ivan, Manuela, and Mark Peo, we are very happy to welcome you here on the occasion of the presentation of Mike Kelley Weiss Anglais. We are incredibly honored to have Mary Claire Stevens, Executive Director of the Mike Kelley Foundation, here with us this evening, and with great thanks to Kate Abrams, my colleague in Los Angeles, and Meredith Sotili for enabling this exhibition to take place. And what a moment to have this here in London in February alongside Tate's exhibition, Ghost and Spirit, which is still on until the 9th of March. So if you haven't seen it, please do go and see it. And now I'm very happy to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Tanya Barson, Curator at Large here at Hauser Wirth, and the wonderful contemporary artist, Grace Ndiritu, as they will be in conversation. And I'm going to let Tanya introduce Grace in more depth. But thank you both very much for being here, and enjoy. Thanks.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Mary Claire, Kate, and yes, thank you to Grace. So, Grace Ndiritu is a British-Kenyan visual artist, filmmaker, and writer whose artworks are concerned with the transformation of our contemporary world. Her archive of over 40 handcrafted videos, textiles, photography, performances, paintings, and architectural spaces have been widely exhibited, most recently in her mid-career survey entitled Healing the Museum at SMAC in Ghent in 2023. And Ndiritu is a recipient of the prestigious Paul Hamlin Foundation Visual Arts Award of 2024 and the winner of the Jarman Award in association with Film London. She has a much longer CV, but I will just give that little brief and tantalizing extract. So, as Zoe said, we're here to celebrate the opening of this exhibition, Weiss Anglais, and we will get into a little bit of the detail of that later during our conversation. But we have a couple of stages to the evening. Shortly, we will open with a short meditation led by Grace. And then we will do a reading of a text that Grace has written for the Tate retrospective catalogue, which takes the form of a letter to Mike Kelley. So we will do that reading, then we'll do some conversation questions, and then open it to the floor. If we run out of time and you have a burning question, we will be in the opening, so feel free to come and ask us if you don't have time to ask that during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Grace.
Hi. Can you just make sure your phone's switched off, please, so it doesn't buzz? We're going to do a very short meditation just to check in, because obviously we've all been running around today, so it's nice to come into the room. So I'd like you to close your eyes and get comfortable in your seat. Try to sit with your arms and your legs a bit apart, with the palms of your hands facing upwards. And let's try to connect with the breath. As we go in, and it goes out. We don't try to change the breath. Come back into the room, open our eyes, feeling calmer, more grounded. The 11th of October, 2023. Dear Mike, I'm writing to you from the other side of the universe, the other side of the veil. I'm writing this love letter hoping you'll hear it. As a fangirl, like many others, I was very sad to hear about your passing. But it's important that you know you didn't die in vain. You in fact inspired thousands of punk rockers, indie kids and young artists like myself to try to forge a distinct path in the art world, to rebel against the mainstream and say up yours to the establishment. So now, as I write this letter to you on the eve of your survey, I wonder what inspired your purity, fearlessness, or some might say recklessness in your life and your work. Perhaps it was your blue-collared background in 1950s Detroit, when the civil rights movement hadn't even happened, and the streets were full of racial slurs as you were learning to ride a bike. By the 1980s, when you were beginning your art career against the backdrop of the conservative politics of Reagan, and when I was born in similarly working-class Birmingham, UK, racial and class divides were still wide, but not as unwieldly as in your youth. By 1991, following the murder of Rodney King, racial tensions reached an all-time high. These subsequently seemed to decline over the years, at least until 2020, when the killing of George Floyd sparked a massive global social revolution led by Black Lives Matter.
I wonder what you would have made of all of this. Your work was not overtly political, but at the same time it did exhibit a wry sense of humour. For instance, in works such as Craft Morphology Flowchart 1991, that occasionally made digs at the conservative right and bolstered feminist thought. I think that by using the feminine art of craft and handmade objects, you were sticking up two fingers to George Bush, to the US military, and to all the heavy industrial masculine equipment that they were producing during the First Gulf War. Coincidentally, in the same period, Craft Morphology Flowchart was also being knitted and sewn. And Mike, I too am a believer in peaceful action, perhaps growing up with a mother aptly named Faith, who went back to study at the Truth and Reconciliation Centre in post-industrial Birmingham when I was 10 years old, led to this. Or maybe it was my love of the playful protests of the Catholic nun, Sister Corita Kent, another historic and prolific LA resident, who took to the streets to protest the Vietnam War. Did you know her, Mike? You must have, since she was a fellow Catholic who had rebelled against the church by making life and art in her own way. In the 1930s, Kent took classes at Otis College of Art and Design, where in 1995 you ended up showing your work in the Neotoma exhibition curated by artist Rennie Petropoulos. Focused on what motivates artists to collect objects, the exhibition showcased your collection of felt school banners, something Kent, with her collection of protest banners and signs, would have appreciated. During Kent's time and against the backdrop of this same war, though on the other side of enemy lines, the work of a Vietnamese Buddhist monk began in earnest. He grew up to become the Nobel Peace Prize nominated leader, Thich Nhat Hanh, who advocated for nonviolent practices until his early death in 2022.
When I read that Thich called this process meditation in action, the worlds of activism and spirituality were, with that one phrase, finally united. For years I'd been torn by having to choose between them. I grew up with an activist, feminist single mother, but had a spiritual animistic practice since I was a young child in Kenya. I could never understand why these worlds were always pitted against each other. How could we possibly make a world a better place without first believing we and all other species are interdependent? And how can we transform the earth if we don't put that belief into concrete action? In 1999, Mike, you presented your paper, Cross-Gender, Cross-Genre, in Graz, Austria, at the Herbst Festival. As Anne Below wrote, titled Remake, Remodel, Secret Histories of Art, Pop, Life and the Avant-Garde, the festival's theme was centred around the politics of queer aesthetics. To accompany the paper, Kelley presented a video installation titled Unisex Love Nest, 1999, at the Palais Athénée in Graz. The film included clips of cross-gender related films and documentations and interviews with some of the artists set against the backdrop of an idolised child's bedroom. This exhibition at the time was of course controversial because of its conversation around trans and non-binary subjects, and I also had a hard time with those words. You might have not thought of yourself as an activist, but in a way, both of us, sometimes in our practices, use the type of what they call nowadays artivism. Yes, that annoying word.
But it was a type of artivism, I admit, that inspired my own body of work, Healing the Museum, which I began in 2012 after meeting the Dalai Lama and Marianne Williamson in the same week. At the time, I was disillusioned with museums. In fact, I said museums are dying, and I believed that the only way to revitalize them was to reintroduce non-rational healing methodologies such as meditation and shamanism to reactivate the sacredness of art spaces, since I saw healing as a type of institutional critique. Your work, Educational Complex 1995, is also a fiercely critical work that links institutions such as schools and universities, art schools, to penal colonies. I wonder, Mike, what you would have to say about the current state of museums or institutions in general. Do you feel that museums are prisons for the objects in them, as I do, about ethnographic museums that hold objects like totem poles hostage? As I wrote in 2021, if you visit the ancient Egyptian galleries at the British Museum in London on any given day, you may not realize that the objects on display are unhappy. They no longer feel special, but objectified, in the true sense of the word, because the cultural and energetic violation that has been enacted upon them through being exposed to endless photographs of tourists and other museum visitors. These objects were never meant to be seen by a single ray of sunlight or looked at by millions of keen museum goers. Hence, they feel like they are being robbed of their agency with no rights of their own. As such, they want to be free. Or perhaps you think museums are open learning centres that espouse the best of what a democracy can be, spaces for sharing, participation, and ethics.
Living off-grid helped restore my faith in art. In 2012, I took the radical decision only to spend time in the city when necessary and to otherwise live in rural, alternative, and often spiritual communities while expanding my research into nomadic lifestyles and continuing my training in esoteric studies such as shamanism, which I began over 20 years ago now. My research resulted in my founding the ARC Centre for Interdisciplinary Experimentation, an off-grid project where scientists, artists, and spiritual practitioners lived together on the outskirts of Paris. But the ARC was also inspired by Chris Kraus's aptly named Chance event in Las Vegas in 1996, hosted by Jean Baudrillard himself, and in which you participated. Chance was the Burning Man of French theory. As Kraus described it, everything ran late, and on the second day, Baudrillard's lecture, the main event, didn't begin until 2 a.m. By then, everyone was drunk, high, and exhausted, and you had 300 people lying on the floor of a theatre listening to him describe high theory in a really thick French accent, with a 6-piece band playing around him. No one understood a thing. It was amazing. Baudrillard, as Kraus recalled, wore a gold lame Liberace suit and sang his lounge song Motel Suicide, backed by Mike Kelley's pickup chance band. It went suicide moi, a type of eerie premonition of future life events.
But how funny you were also in Nevada in a casino, just as I, 10 years later, could be found wandering around the same dunes of Burning Man. I had learnt about the festival back in 1998 when I was backpacking up the West Coast and stopped in San Francisco at the Green Tortoise Hostel. There I met the legendary gardener who was friends with Larry Harvey, the original founder of Burning Man. And as Gardner drove me and a large group of travelers overnight to the Eugene County Fair in Oregon, he explained the history of Burning the Man and its pagan-esque gathering. Mike, what did you think when you were there in 2009 with Michael Smith to make the film A Voyage of Growth and Discovery, aka Baby Icky Goes to Burning Man? As Steve Stern described it, its hours of raw footage follow Baby Icky, a living cartoon played by Michael Smith, tricked out in a saggy nappy, knitted bonnet, and dark glasses, watching the artist totter around wordlessly, pointing and grasping, never quite satisfied, is both hilarious and rather unsettling. It messes with your usual mechanisms of identification and empathy. You, of course, had already excavated this territory and these ideas of absurdity by using craft materials and faux folk art in artworks like craft morphology flowchart. But you were able to let go of your critical art thinking mind and enjoy the colourful insanity of Burning Man with its terrible and equally amazing, gigantesque, plateful art forms. Or was it all about a type of Freudian regression, as it was for me? In 2005, when I finally made it there, the festival theme that year was Psyche. Close your eyes and imagine a giant clock drawn in the middle of the desert. This was the Esplanade, the central point for a city of 30,000 burners. The alphabetized streets that circled the Esplanade were given names inspired by the theme. Thus, I lived at 6:30 between Ego and Gestalt. This is where friends could find me, and also where the postman delivered post once a week. Mike, it was so surreal.
That was the year I first tried holotropic breathing, courtesy of Stanislav Grof's students, and also the first time I met Daniel Pinchbeck, the legendary psychonaut. He was giving a lecture in a dusty tent about the end of the world, 2012, in the main calendar, and he was using a lot of Alex Gray's artwork to do so. A few years later, I met Alex and his wife, Alison, in New York, where I was showing my art video, The Nightingale, 2003, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is when the Greys still had their incredible psychedelic art palace, the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors in Chelsea, before they moved upstate. Did you ever meet Alex Gray? You would have liked him. For one, you could have debated how difficult it was to portray the effects of psychedelics or its memory in an artwork. In their essay, Back and Forth, Mike Kelley's Psychedelic Pedagogy, Mary Elizabeth Anderson and Richard Haley compare your use of psychedelia to Hal Foster's idea of a paralytic work, which attempts to frame the framer as he or she frames the other, whereas you state that one should look back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, a number of times, see if you don't find yourself subsumed in a macrocosmic, microcosmic spatial shift. One coloured a sublime and dingy psychedelic hue.
More recently, I was talking with Ralph Rugroff, who you knew back in San Francisco, about the LSD days. We were talking about the underground labs that had re-begun there in the early 2000s, and Michael Pollan's new book about psilocybin. This was a topic I was very familiar with, as I had just finished editing my experimental feature documentary for BFI London Film Festival, Becoming Plant 2022, which follows 6 dancers who participate in a therapeutic group experiment with psychedelics while temporarily living together on a demilitarized industrial site. I think you would have liked it, Mike. Ralph was talking about one of your first performances, Monkey Island Part 2, 1985, at the Los Angeles Municipal Theatre, in which you used the technique of automatic drawing to talk about extrasensory perception. It is a shame those performances weren't recorded, Mike, as those recordings would have been helpful now, especially as Ralph was just telling me how you encouraged him to curate his first show, Just Pathetic, 1990, at the Rosamund Felsen Gallery, West Hollywood. This was also the gallery that represented you and Paul McCarthy at the time. The group show featured Katie Noland, Chris Burden, Jessica Diamond, David Hammonds, Georg Herold, and Jeffrey Valance, among others. Reviewing it in the Los Angeles Times noted, in fact, pathetic art is adamantly anti-idealistic because mass culture feeds on the propagation of idealized images. Rather than envisaging utopias, yours, mine, or theirs, patheticism simply makes do with what is. What is frequently a mess.
It was you who pushed Ralph in that direction, and now is the director of the Hayward Gallery. Anyway, it sounds like you're a generous guy, which awkwardly and rather clumsily brings me to your suicide. Why do the most generous people like yourself and Anthony Bourdain kill themselves, especially when you might produce one of the most prolific, sprawling, intriguing oeuvres that ever existed, matched only in my estimation by that of Jimmy Durham, my other art god? All to say, your interest in philosophy, politics, history, underground music and decorative arts, as well as issues of normality, criminality and perversion, made a lasting impression on a young textile art student like me. Were you counting on your work outliving your own mythology? Were you hoping that although you weren't here to give guidance, your work still could? I should say that I do believe in reincarnation. Being a Tibetan Buddhist and having seen many past lives, I firmly believe that most of our contemporary problems could be resolved if we just understood we have all been all genders and all races before. As Kelsey Gatso puts it, as we've been born countless times, it follows that we have had countless mothers. Thus, there is not a single being we meet who, over the incalculable expanse of beginnings of time, has failed to be our mother.
But I am not sure you believed in reincarnation, Mike, as you weren't just not religious, but more anti-religious, as we saw in The Uncanny, the exhibition you curated for Sonspeak 1993 in Arnhem. As Valerie Smith described it, occupying 7 rooms, The Uncanny broadly featured 4 typologies of artifacts: contemporary and historical artworks, medical, educational and scientific models, including taxidermies and preserved human parts, photographs, both fine art and documentary, as well as blow-ups of artworks unavailable for the show, and Mike's personal collection of things, which he called the harems. The Uncanny offered a critique cited at the intersection of metaphysics, ontology, and the belief systems that surround the relations between objects and human beings. Kelley wanted to shake the complacency of the people who came in contact with his work. It was important that a person could physically relate to or empathize in a human way with the objects. When I was a student, no one cared about such things as animism, meditation, or yoga, and in fact, people made fun and downgraded my sincere attempt to be both a contemporary artist and a serious spiritual practitioner. But 20 years later, solely thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, the art world finally looked inside itself. At last, it wondered if there was more to life than this material world, to quote Madonna. Now healing and spirituality are the buzzwords of the current art world. Of course, my cynical side despairs at all the spiritual materialism taking part in the neoliberal hallways of culture, but at least I don't have to hide who I am anymore. I had my spiritual coming out in 2012, and every day it gets easier. And I think, Mike, you would have approved of that. But I wonder what you would have made of this development. Would you have hated it, or would you have started meditating like everyone else, just like one of the most rational men in the world, Steve Jobs, who was a huge Zen meditator despite his complex and difficult personality? Would you also have found peace in those Zen koans that hurt one's brain if one tries to analyze them too much? When both hands are clapped, a sound is produced. Listen to the sound of one hand clapping. Out of nowhere, the mind comes forth.
Since we are both misunderstood artists, could you too have learnt to live with ambiguity and paradox, as I have? Or would you have ran away and gone full weird science? The classic 1985 movie in which 2 high school nerds use a computer program to literally create the perfect woman who promptly turns their lives upside down in order to control their changing teen world. Or perhaps you would have pulled out graphs and charts and gone down the science fiction rabbit hole, which inspired works like The Candles, those large-scale glass bell jars containing resin miniatures, 3D interpretations of Superman's home city that in the comics were shrunk down by the villainous Brainiac before being rescued by Superman and protected under a bell jar in his sanctuary, the Fortress of Solitude. These works use both mythology and science to create new substances that could transform the sublime into functional materials for the everyday world. To quote the great quantum physicist David Bohm, in some sense, man is a microcosm of the universe. Therefore, what man is a clue to the universe. We're enfolded in the universe. Mike, we could do with some of those candor technologies as the climate gets worse every day and the politicians debate whether a Green New Deal will solve all our problems. We could do with an anti-kryptonite miracle from Superman for sure, or at least a bell jar to protect ourselves from the coming storms. We also need a miracle in relation to the war with Ukraine and Palestine. And you grew up when the original Cold War was happening, and now we might be entering a new one. What's more disturbing is that I heard recently on a podcast that Putin cannot forgive those who love him, as he thinks they're weak, which indeed says a lot about his state of mind and why this current war is happening. But I do hope you, Mike, can forgive us for still loving you, and wherever you are, I hope you found peace in love and art. Grace.
So,
these are just some clips we're going to play of Mike Kelley's work and my work, and it will make sense as we talk.
So we've begun with a meditation and some readings from your text for the catalogue of the Mike Kelley retrospective at Tate Modern. These both raise issues of institutional critique through healing or play. Can you explain further the relation of this type of institutional critique with what we see in Kelley's work?
Yeah, so behind us we're seeing a clip from Days Done. Obviously, usually there's music, there's a brilliant soundtrack actually to it. But I feel like Kelley uses play as a form, especially in the form of performing arts like theatre, dance, music, as a way of undermining the seriousness and power of institutions like museums or schools or universities. And I feel like he makes a mockery of them in order to change our expectations of what should happen in these formal settings. The movie, it's 3 hours long, so we're not going to watch the whole thing. It's a 5-minute clip. But as you see, as you go along, it gets even more carnivalesque and pantomime-y. And I guess in terms of institutional critique in my own work, as we just talked about, I'd written in 2012 that I thought museums were dying, you know, that they'd lost contact with what was going on outside in the real world. And so I thought about putting new methodologies inside, like shamanism, meditation, so we could attract new audiences through these new energies. And also think about the way that we relate to objects, you know, in the way that we value objects, and kind of think about art history in a new way as well. And I think that's what happens as well in Days Done, because there's a scene where they're having a crit, and they have like certain paintings from art history, but also like high culture and low culture artworks, and they have a discussion. And, you know, he uses a lot of humour to do that, and that's part of the institutional critique.
I think humour is very present in the current show as well, here in the gallery. So I wanted to ask you how you first encountered the work of Mike Kelley, and which works were the first to impact you or interest you, and why?
Well, actually, when I was at art school, I was studying textile art, and I heard about that show, Helter Skelter. It was like a very famous show from '92 from LA. Obviously, I was too young to have seen this show, but it was like a legendary show. Yeah. And I read about it, and I was like, okay, who's this guy? And who's Paul McCarthy? Who's that gang, you know? And then I saw a big retrospective in 2011 at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. It was a brilliant show, and it just had such a profound effect on me. And it just stayed in my mind. And then I was living in LA in 2017, and there was a publication of memoryware. These are certain paintings that Kelley would make, and they launched a book, and then there was a talk with Ralph Rugoff and John C. Welshman, and I happened to be there. So I would say those are the three main points.
And has it changed your understanding of the work as it got deeper over the years? Have you kind of...
Yeah, because I've changed as an artist as well, you know, but also because I see works. I'd never seen the candles until this retrospective, first in Paris, now here, you know. I'd never really seen them in real life in the same way, you know. So I felt like I understand them a bit more, you know, and feel more connected to them now than I did when I was younger. Yeah.
So Kelley worked from a position of some ambivalence towards his Midwestern working class and Catholic background. How does taste, class, religion, or spirituality, and these aspects of cultural identity play out in his work and your own. And how do you see this as being part of Kelley's version of the carnivalesque?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, you just said it perfectly. Working class, Catholic, white. Well, obviously, I'm the opposite. I'm a black woman, but I do come from Birmingham, so that's also working class. So we have this post-industrial city connection. But what I really do love, and maybe this is, remember, I'm not an art historian, I'm an artist, so I'm saying this from my point of view. But he's being able to kind of envision the repressed parts of his mind in his films. You know, Days Done is one, but there's a whole series of these EAPR films. And so those videos are so connected, when I watch them, to what I've seen doing shamanic journeying. And that might sound kind of bizarre, but I'll try and explain why. Because in shamanism, you have different worlds. You have the lower world, the middle world, and the upper world. And the lower world is kind of maybe like animals, it's to do with relations and things. The middle world kind of looks like this, but it's a bit, something wrong, like everything could be upside down. Mm-hmm. And then the upper world, it's more like skies, planetary places and stuff. So when I look at these films, they remind me of kind of maybe in the middle world. So let's say you went to Tesco's and there'd be a talking dog. That's kind of like, it's so absurd, and that's what his films are so absurd. I mean, look at this guy, the devil's rapping. I mean, these girls. So it's kind of like these Freudian symbols that are in his head, you know, that are kind of like disembodied parts, let's say, or memories, you know.
But parts of the mundane, ordinary, everyday life, but also contrasted with the absurd and the carnivalesque.
Exactly. But like in terms of, let's say, using it as a psychoanalytical or kind of a spiritual tool, there is this thing called internal family systems, mm-hmm. in which you talk to different parts of yourself, and they're called exiles. And like when you talk to those parts of yourself, you can kind of heal yourself. Whereas Kelley's doing it in his art, you know, he's like, you know, visualizing those parts instead of like doing it internally. But to me, I can see both sides of it. So, yeah.
So your practice and that of Kelley addresses alternative communities living off-grid, sub- and countercultures. How do you see yours and Kelley's relation to counterculture coinciding? How do you see Kelley's subversive revisiting of grassroots culture and yours being in sympathy?
Okay, this is actually a clip from one of the communities I lived in. These are Hare Krishnas, which I think is a cult, I have to say, after having lived there. But I would say Kelley's film with Michael Smith, The Voyage of Growth and Discovery, so that, to me, it was so funny watching it, because having been to Burning Man, so I went there in 25, 27, and they went there in 29. And watching that film, it just brought back so many memories of, you know, because it's things to do with the freedom and the chaos, you know, versus rules and discipline. And I feel like he likes that. He likes that play, you know, especially in the new film, Vice Anglais. You know, you can see that there's, I mean, that's obviously in the sub-theme of sadomasochism. But at Burning Man, you also have that, you know, and in that film, he, you know, uses the Wicker Man to talk about that as well, and the other references that, you know, talk about paganism. But for me, it's kind of, I was fascinated by Burning Man as well, because I'm interested in this idea of temporary utopias and, mm-hmm. you know, of art and on architecture. So how, you know, you can use architecture to kind of embody people's minds, you know. So I feel, yeah, that's one of our connections.
There was one comment that I found really illuminating in that Kelley made, which was about how American culture takes things that are rooted in paganism, but kind of empties them out and makes them into a kind of a sort of superficial fun. And he gives the examples of Halloween and Christmas as two examples of that. And I think particularly Halloween is that, the kind of commercialism, and it's a kind of surface thing of what was a very deeply rooted kind of pagan tradition. But maybe we do that across the Western world, and it's not just the United States. I think that's very recognizable. So another theme in Kelley's work is education, where formal education is seen as a kind of abuse. I feel there is a relevance here to notions of deschooling society. Ivan Illich's book, the author of the book Deschooling Society in 1970, founded an alternative community in the mid-1960s in Cuernavaca, outside Mexico City. How do other social models and communities find their way into Kelley's work and your own, and how are these relevant to what he calls the educational complex?
Yeah, because educational complex, that's, I guess, one of my favourite works of Kelley's. It's like a huge sculpture of different places that he went to school, and he's tried to make it just from his memory. So there are gaps in the architecture. And I think it's very powerful because it shows you, you know, how, like I was saying, architecture can be used to kind of, or education actually, can be used to free or possess young minds, you know. And so this idea of deschooling is a really important thing. You know, I've been writing about that in my own book, Being Together. A Manual for Living is about, you know, doing these kind of experiments with different types of people, you know, and thinking about how you can change your way of thinking, you know, mixing meditation with also, this is the book actually, doing academic experiments and mixed with meditation.
Yeah.
That's good that didn't happen during the meditation. But also I think about, you know, in terms of architecture, I think of architecture as a type of spiritual technology. And I think it's because of living in all these types of communities and also being around indigenous communities as well, and my grandmother's adobe hut. So I'm always thinking about how the architecture is affecting the group the group dynamics, and how difficult when you live in a community is to balance the individual and the group dynamics. There's this kind of tension, which I think you can see in Kelley's work, you know, especially in that Vice Anglais, you know, there's this power struggle between some of the characters, like the clown or the lady who wants to be free, you know.
There's a dynamics of kind of punishment in this work that we're showing here. Vice Anglais is the kind of euphemism for the English predilection for corporal punishment in education, but also in sexual matters, so spanking, basically. So that's the underlying theme of the works that we're showing here, but they are a completely carnivalesque look at that through a kind of investigation into the origins of counterculture in the Romantic movement. So that's a kind of that in a nutshell. But I think what's interesting is Kelley's use of this term, the educational complex, in a very punning way. So the use of the word complex is both architectural, but it's also Freudian, a complex.
Exactly.
So he's bringing those two things together in an architectural model to then look at his own education and the kind of indoctrination through education as a kind of abuse. So you have to then release yourself from that through a process of deschooling or liberation or countercultural breaking out and breaking free.
Which is kind of like in communities where you live, because I've lived in like Buddhist monasteries that are very disciplined, and then the Hare Krishnas that have no discipline, you know, and then you're seeing, you know, how exactly they're using the certain techniques of, it's not just about dress and food and music, but it's really how, you know, if you've got no locks on the toilet, that means that you are more likely to not understand boundaries, which means that things like abuse can happen, you know. Luckily not to myself, but it has happened in the past, you know, in the Hare Krishna movement, who are obviously just known as happy happy people, you know, selling vegetarian food. Whereas, you know, in Buddhist communities, everything was very, you know, a lot of rules, a lot of structure.
Structured.
So it means a lot of cleanliness, which is also, you know, another way of controlling, you know.
Yeah.
And then you've got Baby Icky. This is a voyage of growth and discovery. This is Mike Kelley and Michael Smith's video about Burning Man.
The other thing he talks about in this kind of educational abuse is an aesthetic abuse and kind of breaking free from the strictures of a kind of education in mid-century abstraction. And so I guess this is the kind of thing of like a breaking free, regressing and investigating the sort of the past of the unconscious through the sort of childhood behaviours in a music festival. So how does Kelley's work and your own offer us a model for the continuation of art and life? How does biography work in yours and his practice? And what is the importance of this lived experience in the work?
Yeah, I would definitely say, well, obviously I didn't know him personally, but from what I've understood in his work, is that art and life, it seems like a continuum. You know, like in mine, you know, living off-grid, then starting the community, the Ark, and, you know, Kelley going to, you know, the Chance event and, you know, singing about suicide. And it's a long day, you know, this idea that life is one long day. It's not actually broken up. But then at the same time, you know, when you look at Days Done and the opening titles, that it's very poetic. It starts with a sunset, you know, actually, which is interesting. The start of the movie is a sunset, but it's inevitable. There's going to be a sunrise, and then there's going to be another sunset. So I think it's very interesting, this idea of this kind of evolution is inevitable. You know, things are going to go on, you know, and evolve. And you can see it in his practice, because he'll be, you know, doing paintings and then videos and then performance and then music. And, you know, it's one total artwork, you know.
And that's there in the very conceptualizing of the extracurricular activities, projective reconstruction, with the EAPR of which Vice Anglais is
avert your eyes.
Vice Anglais is number 36.
Yes.
Day is Done is numbers 2 through 30, and number 1 is slightly different, I think. And it's EAPR number 1 is a domestic scene and investigates, apart from other aspects. Sylvia Plath appears in that, and I think she's also present in this work. But that EAPR structure was a gargantuan, conceived as a kind of gargantuan work of 365 pieces, videos, narratives, or inspired by found photographs, of which he only made a certain number. But of course, 365 is one for every day of the year. So
exactly.
This is part of that kind of lived structure for the artwork.
Exactly, one long day. It's literally one long day.
So, the title of your text is Grief. Can you explain why, and what was the significance of adding that to your love letter to Kelley?
Yeah, because, I mean, my most significant death was my mother when I was 17. But then there were other significant deaths, you know, like River Phoenix, George Michael, Princess Diana, Prince, you know, Jason Rhodes. Like, these influenced my thinking about who I was as a young person. And, you know, great visionary people, why do they have to leave? You know, David Lynch. You know, the world is less without David Lynch in it, even though there could be a new David Lynch, but still. You know, and then I think when Catherine Wood at the Tate asked me to, you know, write something, I felt that that was just the natural way to do, because grief and death are the thing that connects all humans. You know, I always like to think about what we've got in common, actually, rather than what divides ourselves. And yes, you could say, why focus on his death? But then that's just one small part of his story, you know what I mean? Him dying is just one small part, and he's left so much work, you know, that's influenced myself and many others, just like my mother's influenced myself, you know, with her activism and her, you know, her studying truth and reconciliation. There's no way I would be doing a project like Healing the Museum if I hadn't had her as a mother.
Is it a point of greatest empathy between you and other artists, that point of grief?
I guess so, but it's really everything. Everybody's going to experience it, aren't they, at one point, you know? So I think it was important to be honest, because otherwise it would be a lie. Like if I just wrote an essay that denied what happened, it wouldn't make sense, you know? His work isn't less or, more because of it, you know? It is just part of life.
Yes.
Ironically, so that's why. Yeah.
So we have a very short amount of time for any questions, if anyone has any questions to ask Grace or myself.
Yes.
About Kelley, her relationship to Kelley, or indeed the exhibition that we have on in the gallery today.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and that you've made such poignant points about Mike Kelley and his relation to the art world and society as a whole. Now, I was really young when Mike came into the art world and it was happening and I was in school. And I just thought it was the same type of feeling when I heard the first time the Sex Pistols playing and punk asking the world, is this fucking for real, like that we're in? And Mike, like Joseph Beuys, really made you think deeper. And you made that such a good point to say the art world needs to think a little deeper. And has it become almost like a museum park for the sake of just clicks? So thank you, because you're bringing back a spirituality that I think is so much needed, and Beuys and Kelley would thank you too.
Oh, thank you. Oh.
And thanks, Hauser Wirth, because you're the best.
Okay, well, I think if you can join me in thanking Grace for being here this evening. And
Thank you.